Welcome everybody to this SHOC workshop on sharing data sets of pathological speech. I'm very happy that you found your way to this webinar. And my name is Henk van den Heuvel, and I will be hosting this webinar together with my co-presenters, by the way. Let me go to the next slide. So there you see who we are. One back, that's me. Oh, we're going too quick now. Take it easy. So that's me. I'm a director at the Center for Language and Speech Technology at Radboud University in Nijmegen. Other presenters are Nicola Besel from the Department of Speech and Hearing Sciences at University College Cork in Ireland, and Paul Trilsbeek from the Language Archive Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. Libby Bishop from GSIS, Leibniz Institutes for Social Sciences in Cologne, Germany. And finally, Katarzyna Klesa from the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, Poland. And together we have cooked up a nice menu for you regarding sharing pathological speech databases. So let me give you an introduction to this webinar first. The webinar is being recorded, so after the webinar you will receive a link so that you can watch the recording later as well, and of course others can too. Slides will be made available. You will see the link in the chat box. Indeed, the chat box is an important item for today, this afternoon. Do you have questions? Put them in the chat box. And we'll put questions to the speakers. And this will be done at the end of the webinar. So we will have our presentations first, because we rather have a full menu, as you will see here. Let me start with introducing SHOC first, because this webinar is being organized on the initiative of the SHOC project, which is a European project. SHOC stands for Social Sciences and Humanities Open Cloud. It represents one of the 5 cluster projects forming the European Open Science Cloud, also known as EOSC. You might have heard of that. This project will run until April 2022. It's bringing together 45 organizations which are contributing in this project, and alongside and outside the project to the SSH domain. The main objectives of this project are the seamless integration of SHOC into the EOSC and the Social Sciences and Humanities open marketplace, where you can find high quality tools and data. They will be made openly accessible there, but also secure. So that's the whole setup of this project, in fact. SHOC also supports the development of state-of-the-art research infrastructures, as well as research communities in maximizing reuse through open science and FAIR principles. Now, as I told you, this webinar is part of the SHOC training activities. With these activities, the SHOC team supports various research communities in the social sciences and in the humanities, as well as other interested individuals. So in order to meet the skills for, to meet your needs for new skills and to promote the outcomes of the SHOC project. So one of the tasks in the project is one on remote secure access. And it is in fact from this task that we started this webinar, because closely related to this is one of the use cases in this task, sharing data sets and corpora for pathological speech. So the program for this webinar is quite a full one. We will be talking about the DELAD initiative, that's me. Then Nicola will give you some more information on the Gdpr and ethics of this special category data. Paul Trilsbeek about storing and sharing CSD at the Language Archive. So CSD are corpora for speech with disorders. Libby Bishop will have 2 presentations on the remote access to sensitive data and the CAVA project, and Katarzyna will also present a use case of a Polish acute speech corpus of hearing impaired children. So let me introduce the DELAD initiative to you. And DELAD means shared in Swedish, and that is where this initiative started in 2015 by Martin Ball and Nicole Muller. And this initiative to collect and share corpora of speech with disorders, in short, CSD. You see the website where you can find all information. And we were brought together because we saw this need of sharing this type of data. They are very costly to produce, but also very hard to share because of all kinds of privacy conditions. And in order to do that properly, you need a mix of researchers, infrastructure specialists, and legal experts. And that's exactly what DELAD is. We organize annual workshops since that time. And we do this under CLARIN header and support, and address all kinds of relevant topics in these workshops, relevant for sharing this type of data. So we do this under the header of CLARIN, which is the Common Language Resources and Technology Infrastructure. They provide data and advanced tool, especially through a single sign-on online environment. Very many CLARIN centers exist these days. Typically, the B centers are the centers that host data. And one of the centers is represented here by Paul Trilsbeek. And we have knowledge centers. One of the knowledge centers in CLARIN is the CLARIN Knowledge Centre for Atypical Communication Expertise, and we call it shortly ACE, where we have teamed up with the DELAD initiative and teamed up with the Language Archive at the Max Planck Institute so that you can share, make your data accessible and shareable there, and also the Talkbank at CMU. Paul will tell more about this. The use case that we have presented will also be presented today by Kasia. And then we have a next DELAD workshop, which I would like to announce here, will be in the last week of January. Now, if you became interested in this DELAD initiative, please contact me if you would like to join this online workshop, because we are interested in cooperation with other researchers working with this type of data, would like to present their data and talk with us and discuss with us how they can be shared with other researchers and what you need for that. So you're very welcome in this online workshop. Please let me know if you're interested. So I think that's my introduction for now, and we will go to our next speaker, which is Nicola Besel. Nicola, please go ahead.
Thank you, Henk. Thank you for that introduction. So hello, everybody. I'm going to be speaking today from the perspective of a researcher at an academic institution who's involved in the development of corpora of speech disorders. And of course, one of our concerns has been to, and is, to ensure that our collection, our research, and our archiving practices meet institutional, national, and now GDPR standards. This is, of course, important for the process of ethical approval at a local level, but also for compliance with national and European law. And it's also important to be able to assure participants that their data is collected, processed, and stored not only legally, but with proper regard to their relationship to the data that they are contributing to research. This is important for all data collection, obviously, but arguably particularly so in the case of disordered speech data. So another of my goals when collecting disordered speech data is to be able to contribute the data to central databases such as DELAD that Henk talked about, so that it can be a continued research use. But the problem with most of my existing data is that I don't have explicit permission for sharing, and that means that I can't share it. And some of us, of course, will be familiar with previous ethic approval practices where, and in some cases they may still obtain, where data sharing is limited to the researchers that are listed on the project, and you're required to outline who those researchers might be. So an additional problem is that audio and visual data of disordered speech comes with particular challenges because of the links, because of the risks of identification. So since the implementation of GDPR in May of 2018, I think many of us have worked to understand and apply the directives so that our work can be collected appropriately and safely for those to agree to contribute their data. So first of all, GDPR recognizes that voice and speech data are forms of personal data because one can be identified through them. So under GDPR, processing of personal data is ordinarily prohibited. So one way around this problem is, of course, full anonymization of the data, because fully anonymized data is no longer personal data. But the problem for collection of speech and, of course, certainly disordered speech samples is that the audio or visual manipulation of the data denatures the signal and limits its research use. A second option is to pseudonymize the data. Oops, I'm sorry, I have skipped to, looks like I've missed a slide there. A second option is to pseudonymize the data, but under GDPR, this is still considered personal data because there's the potential for identifiers to be reunited with the parent data. And of course, with clinical data, we need to be able to access metadata that may include information about health conditions and so on. So let me just check the order of the slides here because I think they've gone a bit wonky. Okay. Right. So lawful basis is required for the processing of data, and under GDPR, for us as researchers, the lawful basis for our use of personal data is performance of a task in the public interest. Okay, so now I think I've caught up with my slides. But it's also important to note that health-related data of the sort that we collect in research on speech disorders requires the additional rationale of being necessary for the research, and in the case of archiving, the processing of the health-related data is in the public interest. And of course, there's also the fact that the speech data itself may be considered health-related data because many voice and speech characteristics are diagnostic indicators. So, in addition to meeting the requirement of being necessary for research in the public interest, processing health data requires safeguards, namely research ethics, data minimization, anonymization or pseudonymization where possible, and security of data handling. And of course, most collection of clinical speech data goes on in institutions that require research ethics approval, independent of GDPR and as part of existing national data protection laws. But being GDPR compliant requires attention to these requirements. And I think there's now a degree of planning and follow through that must be implemented and documented in a transparent way. And I think not all of us have been accustomed to that degree of transparency. So let me see now. Okay. So consent is one of the 6 possible lawful bases for the processing of personal data. And as a legal basis, it must meet certain requirements, but those requirements are generally speaking caught by the ethics application in research institutions. In particular, I suppose the ones that are relevant to us are details of sharing of data and details of storage of data. So the process of seeking explicit consent, informed consent, is the main vehicle for meeting these ethical responsibilities. And of course, we have to be particularly careful with disordered speech populations that we are providing information and consent forms in appropriate language. So as an example of the kinds of explicitness that we are now required, or I think it's beneficial for us to use in our ethics applications at the institutional level, I provided an example here from the UK Data Service. And if you look at the yellow arrow, you can see that there's there's a checkbox for explicit agreement to audio recording and archiving and dissemination, for the transcript, and also for any visuals they've got photographs in this particular example, but of course it could be video recording. And here also is an example of an explicit opt-in consent for other researchers having access. And you can see here that there's a category of quote-unquote authenticated researchers that's being applied. Clearly, this has to be defined in information sheets, and researchers have got to be able to show records that track the use and authentication of these researchers. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And if there are any questions, I'll be very pleased to answer them in the chat afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That was very, very well on time. Thank you for this interesting introduction to the GDPR, indeed. So we will proceed to Paul Trilsbeek, who will tell us something about data sharing and how this is possible at the Language Archive in Nijmegen.
Yeah, there it is. Thank you, Henk. Yes, I will tell you something about how we store and share corpora, speech disorders, or corpora in general at the Language Archive. Just very briefly, what is the Language Archive? So it exists since the late 90s. It's a repository that contains data collections from various language-related research disciplines. We're holding more than 350 collections with more than 250 different languages from around the world. We are a CLARIN Centre and also hold the Core Trust Seal certification for trustworthy repositories. An important part of our collection is the DOBIS archive, resulting from the DOBIS Documentation of Endangered Languages funding program. Part of our collection is also recognized by UNESCO as Memory of the World since 2015. So we're essentially a research data repository as well as an archive of cultural heritage at the same time. Archiving and sharing of speech data, clinical speech data, as Nicola already said, anonymization is not really possible without invalidating the data for many research purposes. So we do not transform people's voices, for example. So that means that the GDPR applies because it is considered personal data. GDPR has explicit provisions for processing of personal data for research purposes, and archiving is also seen as processing. And there are several legal grounds, as Nicola already mentioned. So there is the informed consent, archiving in the public interest, and also there's the legitimate interest ground. They all have their issues, which I don't have time for to go into, but somebody advanced the slide. What is also necessary is agreements, so of two kinds, basically. So there's between the creator of the data and us. There is the deposit agreement, which also is seen in GDPR terminology as a processing agreement. And then there, on the other side, on the data use side, you have the license agreement or data use agreement. Something that I recently realized is that actually quite a number of licenses that are commonly used are not really compatible with the GDPR because they are perpetual. So they don't say anything about deleting the data after the work has been concluded. So what a repository needs to do is obviously provide an appropriate technical solution. Data protection by design and by default is something that is stated in the GDPR, which means that you run up-to-date systems, up-to-date software, make sure that you apply security patches in a timely manner. Transport of data in and out of the repository should happen in a secure manner. And we also have an elaborate system of access policies and authorization. I will come back to that in a moment. All archived copies of the data in our repository reside within the European Union, so in the Netherlands and in Germany, at trusted data centers within the Max Planck Society. Encryption is mentioned in the GDPR as an appropriate protection measure, but there are some issues with encryption in relation to long-term preservation of data. Basically, it introduces a significant risk for the long-term preservation. So it basically makes it that you can't do anything with the data while it's sitting in the archive. So at the moment, we don't encrypt audiovisual data in our archive yet, but we are looking for a solution that will still allow us to do this while mitigating the issues I mentioned. The access policies that I mentioned. So we have several access levels. Data can be completely open to the public, so no registration required. Data can be accessible to any registered user. Data can be accessible to any academic user, or data can be restricted. And in case it's restricted, then explicit permission is needed on an individual basis for a specific set of data. The depositor basically decides which level is the most appropriate for the data, and that can be different levels within one collection. So, for example, anonymous transcripts could be open or available for registered users, whereas the audio recordings can be restricted. Authorization, we validate new user account registrations manually to see whether they are genuine users rather than bots or people trying to abuse the system. So we do that by hand, and we also optionally validate their academic status. Another option is that people log in via their own academic account with the federated shibboleth login, and in that case, the account is activated immediately, and their academic status is automatically assigned. So as I said, access to specific restricted materials is granted to individual users once a request has been approved. And such a request, users have to specify what they intend to do with the resources. So as Henk already mentioned, we have an exchange with Talkbank at Carnegie Mellon University in the USA for sharing the non-sensitive parts of these atypical speech collections. So that means that anonymous metadata and anonymous transcripts and annotations are made publicly available in the appropriate part of the Talkbank system. The sensitive parts, so the audio typically or video, are stored in our repository, and links are provided from the Talkbank pages to the locations in our repository. And we think this is a good way to maximize visibility of these collections while still ensuring that they are compliant to the legal situation. Some general thoughts about the GDPR. As with any complex law, there's room for many different interpretations, and there is no case law yet for the GDPR in relation to academic data. So nobody really knows how it's supposed to be interpreted. Also, there are different local implementations in the different member countries that make things even more complex in an international setting. And so there are basically different approaches. You could say, well, the better safe than sorry approach, we stop sharing our collections and don't make them available to anybody else, but that's clearly in conflict with the FAIR principles of proper scientific conduct. So I think the better approach is to comply to the best of our ability, knowing that there is a chance that we may not always be 100% compliant, in particular with older pre-GDPR collections. So I think there's a lot of room for amendments and improvements of the regulations, and also for at the higher political levels to make things more clear for data in scientific context. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think we'll now go to our next speaker, Libby Bishop. Libby Bishop will present two stories consecutively, one on a use case, so to speak. This is the CAVA project, and then she will also detail a bit about another way of approaching data, which is remote secure access. Libby, you have the floor.
Thank you, Henk. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I look forward to I hope, trying to connect these two stories, one about a particular repository and one about this current work in SSHOC. So let me begin by saying, although I am a researcher by training and have a decent credentials in the social sciences, I'm speaking today from the perspective of infrastructure, which can be really boring, I agree, except for the fact, my way of presenting it is infrastructure is boring except when it doesn't work or doesn't do what you need it to. And so I've been working with trying to get infrastructures in place, in particular focused on difficult or unusual kinds of data, whether qualitative, sensitive, or other, for a number of years now. So I'll speak from that perspective of working with infrastructures. So very quickly, because of some of the points that I'm needed to make have been made, I'm going to say a little bit about this CAVA project, the Human Communication Audiovisual Archive. It goes back quite a ways now, as you can see, and I have, with generosity from my colleagues here, particularly Merle Mahan at UCL, borrowed their slides and therefore kept the branding. These were the original slides that they presented. So, but it's a story of the building of an archive to be able to share audio and visual content. Many of the issues that they addressed have already been mentioned, but I think it's worth a quick reminder. So I'm going to go through with a short story of CAVA. So the goal was to establish a digital video repository for human communication sciences, populated largely with a combination of pathological speech, but also learning speech, to house it at UCL, do the things that the other speakers have mentioned, make the catalog accessible using findable metadata, enable data access, develop procedures, and so forth. And also ultimately to look at the long-term solutions, long-term options for preservation and so forth for these files, which is a bit of the sticking point, which is what I'll come back to at the end with my conversations about infrastructure. So it was an absolutely marvelous collection, hundreds of hours of this kind of variety of material. Other people have now talked about what's held in these similar collections. So, but even 10 years ago, this was an incredible resource and still is. So, but it needed a home, and it ended up finding one in the Digitool repository at UCL, and accomplished, some of these initial goals with making metadata available, using metadata standards at the time, change histories, access control capabilities, and so forth, and did get built within the UCL system. I'll show that a bit later. However, as other people have already talked about, there were huge issues, both on the legal, ethical, but also on the technical side that had to be addressed. Consent has been raised, especially retrospective consent, dealing with the material that had already been collected, but with ambiguous or contradictory consent conditions. Access controls were complex, particularly, again, trying to make that access control nuanced enough to handle item-specific level access. The technical work to underpin the access system is not so easy, and again, the issues of long-term preservation, making sure that this material could be still accessible 5, 10, 50 years later. So slide is a bit distorted, but this is what it looked like in its original website presentation at UCL. So nicely housed within a family of related materials with good search capability. Then what I want. So 10 years later, that's the jump I want to make. What is significant is that this was a relatively small project initially with relatively limited funding. And that's the kind of point that I want to get to. So what in some ways is significant is that it's still going 10 years later, has managed to, now it sits within the UCL system with a family of many, many more related collections, and also the user interface, search tools, standards, and so forth behind the scenes are much advanced, as has been improved in these things have been improved over the last 10 years. So, but what's significant? What I want to get to is the post-project issues and what's changed in these 10 years. So the issues still for these individual smaller repositories concern sustaining maintenance and growth. Costs are high, costs of access, storage, etc. So what's significant for 2020 is merely the fact that it is still functioning is a huge accomplishment, even at a modest level. The permission system, the access system, works through the original owners of the data, if you will. So through some of the original primary investigators grant permission on an individual basis for data use. This system has the great advantage of very strong control. It certainly prevents misuse of the data. However, of course, it does not scale. These are issues for long-term use, and it does not address the issues of what happens when these people are no longer available to make such decisions. New data can come in, but it's extremely limited in how much can be processed because the resources are limited, because the project funding, of course, ended in 2010. This has been sustained with minimal bits of ongoing funding. It was hoped that the UK Data Archive might be able to house this kind of data, but that was not considered not possible due to, again, to resource limitations. And so it continues to be a success story, but in a rather limited way from again the standpoint of long-term infrastructure and sustainability. So that's what takes me to then the current state. Fast forward to where we are now with this general issue of access, to, particularly remote access, but to these kinds of challenging data, whether they're sensitive for ethical reasons, sometimes difficult access for intellectual property or other kinds of restrictions. Firstly, qualifier, my expertise is largely within the social science domains, not at all in speech. These areas, but the issues really, I think, are quite similar. Excuse me. Now, what's developing within the social science infrastructures regarding data access is a proliferation of many successful kinds of infrastructures. The Nordic countries are gathering to enable access to microdata. Here in Germany, the research data centers led by LIFB and a number of others are enabling superb support and remote access for educational related data. I won't go through each of these. Each one is contributing to an infrastructure in distinctive ways, and this is important. But we do have a proliferation of small to medium-sized infrastructures, and that I would suggest is potentially an issue, or at least something of concern. So hence where SSHOC fits in, and Hank's introduction, I think, covers a little bit about what SSHOC is attempting to do. Don't want to go into the broad scope of the project, but within the work package and the task that Hank and I are working on is trying to advance the infrastructure landscape, if you will, for remote access to sensitive data. And that's hang on, I want to go back one slide to finish up here. So, and what that's trying to do, what the goal is within SSHOC is to look at, is it even feasible to think about moving toward a broader based infrastructure, maybe with distinct national branches or sub-branches, but something that at least we begin talking about at a European level in order to address these generalized problems that every single repository or smaller institution has to solve, and also to begin to look at the sustainability, the sustainable funding for these individual repositories, because the problem I see everywhere is inability to get long-term sustainable funding for many of these initiatives that are often funded by third-party funding, by short-term EU projects, but don't then have an institutional, secure long-term home. So this is what SSHOC is attempting to do, and we're going to tackle a couple of different problems. One thing we've almost got solved, not quite, is making open, one of our outputs, a deliverable, is a framework for data use, which is making open one of the contracts that needs to be in place for some of this data sharing to occur, the contract between a data owner and the repository. But the next big thing is to produce a set of requirements and recommendations for what remote secure access would look like for both the social sciences and humanities. Now, and develop a recommendation for the platform and the recommendations to EOSC for what that new infrastructure investment should look like. Now, this might sound easy, but Hank and I will tell you it is not. So I know you cannot read, of course, the little diagram in the lower right, but that represents hours, days, weeks of work by several in our group, simply trying to look at what it would mean to harmonize a set of access categories to enable access to this data. The reasons for restricting data are different. The conditions, whether or not what some people call moderate restricted in one domain, differ in the other. So this actually requires a fair bit of work. We're getting there. I think we're making good progress. Fortunately, I'm quite pleased the project has got well over a year to go. We've got a lot of work to do. But I think to wrap up, what I'm getting at is, there are kind of two pathways where I see the infrastructure world developing. That's the proliferation of many more small repositories, even small to medium size. And I understand the appeal. I've worked on several of them. I helped build a second one on for qualitative longitudinal data. The attraction is the ability to have complete control over building exactly the kind of infrastructure that you need for your specific data. But the problem is long-term sustainability and getting these things embedded in a world in the future where I think our funding our funding sources are going to be dwindling even more than they are now, is a real problem. So maybe a European open cloud is a possible way to a sustainable infrastructure. I really don't know, to be honest. I hope so. But we need to stop reinventing every person or every institution inventing their own small-scale solution. I think we will only see the demand for services for remote work and remote access grow because of COVID and everything else. However, there are certainly major concerns with cloud-based kinds of solutions. There are serious privacy issues, particularly where the actual physical infrastructure for cloud platforms is located. Is that compliant with GDPR restrictions? So which way do we have? Is a cloud an ice cream castle in the air kind of solution, a perfect solution, or is it an illusion? We hope to have a better answer by the conclusion of the SSHOC project. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Libby. I see lots of hands with applause, so that's a good sign. Let's go to our last speaker, which is Katarzyna Klesa, and she would present a use case which has been carried out in the framework of the DELAD initiative and with the Knowledge Centre for Atypical Communication Expertise. Katarzyna. You have to unmute yourself, Katarzyna. Top of screen, left button. You see your microphone? Hmm. Perhaps, Kasia, you could leave and then rejoin, because when you, yeah. Okay, Kasia will come again. And then we can proceed with our presentation. In the meantime, we can perhaps answer a question.
Now?
Okay, yes, you're audible now.
Yeah. I'm very sorry. It was just disabled. I mean, I couldn't press the microphone button. Okay,
That's okay.
Do you want to proceed with questions, Hank, or do you want me to present right now?
No, please do the presentation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so hello, everyone. Today, I am speaking from the perspective of a speech researcher, mostly working on corpus data. Later in my presentation, I will report in a few words on the work done by my colleague, Anita Lorenz. I will get back to that, and I believe Anita is with us today. So if yes, just welcome. And in my part, I would like to point out to certain issues in disclosure and curation of archival corpora with respect to the old data that were already mentioned by Libby, by Paul, and also by Hank. So the data that were created before the present regulations. And I would like to refer back to some selected legal research and technical aspects of the processes of disclosing and curating the data, the archival data. So the first one is of legal nature. It's the license attribution, and we all agree, I believe, that nowadays the explicit license attribution is really useful and recommended, even for the corpora that we share with no access restriction. It's always good to state what people can or cannot do with the data. However, when we look at the old data, the data created before the current regulations, we come across various problems, and some of them cannot be solved with the tools that we have. For example, because we do not only miss the license, but we also do not have actually the trace of consent of any kind, because many of the data were collected based on oral agreements between the researchers or data contributors and the participants of the experiment, the speakers, or in case of children, of their representatives, their guardians, school directors, or other persons. So there is an issue to be solved here. The next area, so we do face some legal limitations, and in terms of research, when we think of research perspective, we as scientists are very often willing to share our data after we collect them, describe, and so on. It's something that we would like to do to make them reusable, interoperable. It seems very fruitful, and it seems the right thing to do. So it's kind of a trade-off needed here between the legal and the research perspective. When we think of another area, so we have the legal, the research perspective, and also in case of the archival or the old, so to say, data, we really can face some technical issues that are not present in case of contemporary created resources. And so the contributors may really face some unexpected problems and need some additional help from engineers, from the technical staff. And now, what I would like to show you is an example how can corpora of disordered speech can be found through one organization and made accessible by the other. For that, we use several platforms. Two of them were described already in short by Hank. So DELAD and K-Center for Atypical Communication Expertise. So these are our starting points. DELAD is a collaborative platform, as it was said, connecting researchers. The K-Center, the ACE K-Center, is a platform providing, among others, real-life support for data contributors. So we can feel safe with all those legal research or technical problems when we address them with some questions. So these are the two platforms that we started with, and we shared our data through Talkbank. And I believe most of you, or of those people who are interested in corpora and speech communication, know Talkbank very well. It's a well-recognized platform. So let me just guide you through Talkbank how to find our corpus, our example data here. So first of all, we need to click on here on the in the child language banks on the CHITES, then go to index corpora. Next to the clinical corpora, so you can see how many of these corpora there are in Talkbank. And finally, we see the PCSC, a mysterious abbreviation, and some metadata. So age range, because this is a child speech corpus from for children from 8 to 12 years. There are 20, the number of 20 speakers, hearing limited. And we can see our beautiful profile of the Polish corpus of acute speech of hearing impaired children. And the corpus was created in 2006 by Anita Lawrence. So as you can see, it was already almost 15 years ago. And the public records of this corpus includes the original collection by Anita, but also some additional materials developed by with the help from our colleagues from ACE. So the additional materials includes one session long concatenated recording for each session, and also transcripts in the chat and phone format, which is very useful for certain research procedures. Yeah, and I'm almost done. So this is our example corpus, and the beginning, the starting point for the corpus was the DELAD. Then we worked with the ACE, shared via Talkbank, and so we could only share some part of it. So the recordings and transcript, the rest have to be made restricted due to the legal limitations. So that's it. And about multiplying the places where you can access data, what we are thinking of now is to also to use some local repositories. We do have CLARIN PL. We are lucky to have a nice a nice portal called DSpace, very flexible and intuitive, but we still need to decide how to exactly share our data, whether we want to share only the original collection, but or some additional materials. That's up to the future decision. But I think, and I believe we all agree that it would be useful to have it also in a Polish center of CLARIN, since the corpus is in Polish. Yeah, and yeah, my last slide. Yeah, it's here. So, well, I would just say, and I hope I did, or we all demonstrated it, that the most important word here regarding sharing, well, curating, disclosing the process of dealing with data is collaboration, and so that's really the key to success in data curation and disclosure. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kasia. The interesting thing of this database is that it is made visible and shown in an American, in the USA portal, Talkbank, whereas the data itself is stored on European soil. And this is, of course, in the light of GDPR, also an important feature of the dataset. Yeah. There are a couple of questions, so we are happy to take these now. First question was posed by Esther Horn to Paul Trilsbeek. So the question is, are consent forms, are these also archived at the TLA?
No, actually they are not, because that would pose an additional risk in case of a data breach. If unauthorized people would get access to the data and the filled-in consent forms are part of the data set, that would be an additional risk. So I think the general consensus is that one should not do that. But obviously that's also an issue if we need to prove at some point that those people gave consent for the archiving of these materials. Then we need to go back to the depositors and hopefully they have stored them somewhere such that they can still retrieve them. But that's an issue that is a bit tricky.
All right. Thank you. There's a question by Rob van Som. With reuse of old data or data from patients, there's a problem of deceased speakers. The GDPR does not cover deceased people. Still, what rules or principles should be used with speech from people who have died? Perhaps I can ask this question to Nicola.
Yeah, thank you, Henk. I don't know what the answer to that is. I would be scooting to my data protection officer to find out an interpretation there. I'm not a legal expert in any way. But you're right, GDPR does not cover deceased. And I suppose I would fall back on some discussion, about general ethical principles about dealing with this, in addition to the fact that confirming that GDPR doesn't apply to deceased people, which, as I understand it, it doesn't. And I suppose I would argue that you do need to continue to be respectful of information that's distributed about participants, regardless of whether they're deceased or not. And if you have no, I suppose in the absence of permission going forward, I personally would be cautious. I don't know what anybody else thinks about that on the panel. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Nicola. There's a question also about where would you recommend to store data and metadata from the field of Logipedics at the moment? Perhaps I can ask this to Paul as well. Are they welcome at the TLA?
Yes. I mean, we have a collection development policy, so we typically decide on a case-by-case basis whether we accept collections, and people have to write like 1 page of what the collection is, how much data it is, and then we see how much work is involved from our part. Now, in this case, we also have, of course, the collaboration with the case center. So if part of the creation work, for example, can be done at your end, Henk, then that also is a factor, of course, whether we can accept the collection or not.
Yeah. So I hope this is a satisfying answer for you. And there's a question, another question from Esther Horn, which has to do with the data controllership. So, Libby, this is a question to you, as far as I can see. So, is in this work package in SSHOC, is the question explored if an ERIC, so CLARIN ERIC, for example, or DARIA, can be considered a European legal entity, and the CLARIN B Center can be perceived as a controller under the GDPR. So
I give, I'm afraid, my standard GDPR answer, which is I'm not a lawyer and I'm not sure. But of course, it is a legal entity, so that should qualify it. I think the more complex question would be if we really are looking at some kind of centralized, infrastructure. Very certainly, it will need to have some kind of separate legal controls. That will, because different data owners will have different, somewhat different requirements. So it's a very good question to add to my set of challenges. But I honestly don't have the answer whether or not the ERIC would qualify. Even if it does, I still think there would need to be some kind of devolved data controllership to handle cross-national, multinational data holdings. If I can also add one other comment, I'm not sure whether all participants can see every comment, but I just wanted to second the response where others were suggesting while we don't archive signed consent forms, it's good practice to archive a blank consent form so that you have a record of the terms of condition, terms of consent with the collection, but you don't have any of the data, the personal data risk.
Yes, that was a good addition to this. Let me see if there are any other questions. Then perhaps I can ask a question also to Nicola. Which provisions would you say need to be addressed for sure in the consent form when it comes to special category data?
Such as clinical data?
Yes, exactly.
Yes. I think you need to be as explicit as you can be about any, well, from my perspective as an independent academic researcher, my response to that would be that you need to be as explicit as you are able to be without boxing yourself into a corner necessarily about what you anticipate as the future uses of your data. So I think one of the critical things is, for me at any rate, is ensuring that I've formulated my consent so that I have permission to share. I mean, that's the one thing that I'm focused on at the moment because I haven't been explicit. I haven't explicitly requested that beforehand. And I find it's interesting to me to see that, people are exploring workarounds to this. But I suppose at the moment, I don't think I would, I don't know that my institution would back me in sharing data for which I don't have explicit consent for sharing. So therefore, my tack at the moment is to be as explicit as I can be about any intentions that I have. And that's one of the reasons why it would be extremely useful for me to be able to say, do you agree to the archiving of this data with DELAD, for instance? And then to be able to provide the assurances around data management and so on for that material that DELAD provides. And I think another one of the issues is that we're all having to satisfy independent institutional ethics boards, and they can vary considerably in what they are willing to take on board at a particular point in time, and that can change. So I think at the moment, for me, explicitness is a useful tool. Does that answer your question, Hank?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, we have a remark from Barbara Burnett from Canada, and she says, of course, not all people taking part in our research data collections have literacy skills. So in Canada, it's possible to get video recorded consent from these people. Could I ask to one of you in the panel if this is also possible under the GDPR? My own answer would be that it is. We also have the possibility to have recorded answers, so you can have speech recordings with the answers, and even if it's possible, but you have to make very good notes, that you have just a note where you say this person gave consent. It is possible, but on the line and in the spectrum of what is desirable, it is the last one. Let me see if there is a final question, because we are approaching the clock. Okay, yes, interesting. Thank you, Barbara, for another note. And we have a mark by Libby Bishop with a consent on GDPR advice from the UK Data Service, where you find a link to this. All right, I think it's 3 o'clock. I do not see any other questions at this time. So I would like to thank all participants for being with us. Let me have here the final slide where you can see where you can approach us. Also, when you're interested in this DELAD workshop in January, please drop me a line. It's on the slide. We will be happy to welcome you to the DELAD community too. So I hope you found this interesting, and thank you very much for your attention, and hope to see many of you around.